What are banks for? Who's to blame for the economic crash? Is capitalism itself in crisis? Mistakes made in Wall Street and the City of London are paid for by people all over the world. As inequality rises, so does anger. And those who are supposed to regulate the banks stand accused of being asleep at the wheel. Lord Adair Turner is one of the world's most influential financial policymakers. He was at the helm of the UK's Financial Services Authority in the wake of the 2008 banking crash. My name's Mehdi Hasan, and I've come here to go head-to-head with Adair Turner in front of an audience and to challenge him on whether capitalism has a future and what to do about those banks. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lord Adair Turner. The former regulator has been attacked for being too close to the industry, but more recently, he's become much more critical of bankers and the global financial system. We have been through the worst financial crisis in living memory, some say in 100 years. The big question that people are still asking, almost 5 years on, is who started it? Who's to blame?
What happened in 2008 wasn't just the product of the misbehavior of individual bankers or over-exotic derivatives developed in the 3 or 4 or 10 years before the crisis. I think it had deeper roots. I think really 30 or 40 years ago, we began to develop an idea that finance was just a market like any other market, a market like the market for shops or the market for car manufacturers, and that the same propositions about the benefits of free markets, which work pretty well in the market for restaurants or car manufacturers, work in finance, and they don't. And as a result, we simply didn't pay attention to a set of trends which had been going on for many years, which had seen the financial system in rich developed countries just get bigger and bigger relative to the size of our economies. You can see that measured in things like what's called the overall level of leverage, the level of debt relative to people's income. I've really spent the last 4 years slowly waking up to what a deep crisis we're in. And
how far back does it go? You said many years.
Well, I would say it was from the 1970s onwards, some of the deregulations, the periods of deregulation,
reforms,
and then it just becomes more and more intense. It becomes more intense in the 1990s with the takeoff of the derivatives markets, with the deregulation of the role of the investment banks in the US.
But these things didn't happen by accident. We all know how banks got out of control. You mentioned some of the toxic assets and the things they cooked up. You were, until very recently, the chairman of the Financial Services Authority, the FSA, Britain's top financial regulator. I think it was abolished at the end of March. Why did the FSA not see any of these flaws that we now all identify? Why was it allowing banks to get away with all this behaviour?
The most fundamental mistake is to allow banks to do too much business on a light level of capital.
But is that because you guys were asleep at the wheel, is the question
I think a lot of people were asleep at the wheel. It happened over a long period of time.
Specifically the regulators?
Well, the regulators and the central banks. I mean, the regulators and the central banks together were responsible for the development of the capital regime for the banking system. And if you look at those regimes then, there just wasn't enough capital in the banking system. And it's quite startling to look back at it. How did anybody ever think that it was a sensible thing for a mortgage bank to lend £100 of mortgages on the basis of 99.5% of borrowed debt and only 0.5%, a half percent,
some would say,
of equity? But that's what they were doing. And it was a crazy thing that we allowed them to do.
Wouldn't some say that the reason for that is because regulators split basically into two types of people. There were people working in regulatory agencies who were either in awe of the banks and wanted to go and work for banks, or there were those who were basically intimidated by the banks, who were outgunned, intellectually and financially outgunned by the big banking lobby.
I think that was...
You had small regulatory agencies up against massive banks.
I think that is part of it, but you also have to understand that some very apparently fine economists, people who worked in central banks, in regulators, 10 years ago were telling a story about the benefits of the capital regime. And somehow along the line, they convinced themselves that this over-leveraged banking system was essential for the economy.
Let me bring in Anne Pettifor, who's a director of the think tank Prime Economics. She's a fellow of the New Economics Foundation in London. Rather presciently, in 2006, she wrote a book called The Coming First World Debt Crisis. And you're listening to Adair here talking about the intellectual failures and the regulatory failures. How big do you think they were?
I think they were massive, but I wanted to say that we ought not just to blame the regulators. We need to blame two other groups who I think are deeply responsible but often escape scrutiny. The one is the economics profession, and I think it's appropriate that we should discuss that here at the Oxford Union, who cheered on this liberalisation and this deregulation all the way through, and who became hired guns, effectively, in making the case. And the second is the politicians. The fact is that ultimately it's politicians that sign the rule book and that enforce the rule book.
Let me bring in Jon Moulton, who's sitting to your left. You are a venture capitalist, founder of the British private equity firm Better Capital. I think it's worth hundreds of millions of pounds. When you hear people say it was regulation that was the problem, the lack of regulation, and we need more regulation, what's your response to that?
Before the crash, the regulation was ineffective, and very obviously so. Anne was writing in 2006. I was even shouting about it in 2005. It was obvious that there was too much leverage. It was obvious that there was too much interconnection. It was obvious we had too big to fail. It was obvious that we had way overpaid bankers with inappropriate motives in what they were to do things to get bonuses. The control of the accounting was out of control. It was all blasted obvious. Nobody wanted to hear it. The politicians didn't want to hear it because they were enjoying the growth driven by the credit boom. We need simple, hard rules. We don't need thousands of pages and thousands of bright people. It's a waste of talent.
It's a waste of time.
I happen to agree with Jon on that. It's as if we've got, a car without shock absorbers driving along a motorway without crash barriers, and because of that, we've crowded a whole load of people into the driving cab to look over the driver's shoulder. If we'd actually designed the fundamental rules in a better system, we probably wouldn't need as many regulators as we have. But can I pick up Anne's point as well? The point about credit and what was obvious. What you end up with is a belief that the economy will only deliver income and jobs, particularly for lower income people, if you are providing huge amounts of credit. Credit to lower income households is almost making up for the fact that they haven't got good enough jobs to start with. Give them credit because we can't give them good income jobs. So there's a very deep point about the way that we ended up believing that the only way we could have full employment economies was with this continual growth in the amount of debt relative to our national income.
Costas Lapavitas is also with us. He's a professor of economics at the University of London, author of the book Crisis in the Eurozone, a Greek economist. What do you take of what you're listening to?
Regulation, we've had plenty. It's incorrect to think that there has been no regulation in the last 30 years. There's been stacks of regulation, reams of it. All of it, however, has been market-conforming regulation. It has been conducive to financialization. It's been regulation designed by banks for banks, and it hasn't worked. So regulation alone is not the answer, although I fully agree that we need better regulation than we've had before. We need to think of the structural underlying transformations that need to come about. And simply raising the amount of capital will not tackle that.
You mentioned the thinking that led to some of these intellectual mistakes. We've talked about the role of regulators, but it wasn't, as you say, it wasn't limited to this group. There's the role of government. There are international institutions like the International Monetary Fund, which was hailing all this financial innovation.
It was.
There are the credit ratings agencies that was giving AAA ratings to some of these toxic assets. But none of these guys, put punishment to one side and justice. In terms of actually getting rid of them from the scene, they're all still hanging around the scene. These economists who got it wrong, the IMF, the ratings agencies. How can you move forward when you've got all the people who helped cause the crash still in influential global positions?
When you get mistakes made, sometimes there are people who've made mistakes and who have the technical skills of economists who are, capable of seeing what's gone wrong. And I don't think you can simply say we've got to completely get rid of the entire set of people who've been involved in that process. But it's very, very important that we learn from those mistakes and we understand what a deep set of mistakes were made. And along with the Great Depression of the early 1930s, this is the biggest setback other than global wars, it's the biggest peacetime setback to the growth of prosperity that's occurred.
You yourself are not just a former regulator, you're also a former banker. You started off your career in banking.
Yep.
I think you were vice president for Merrill Lynch Europe.
I was.
From 2000 to 2006. Here's what I'm wondering. When you were working at Merrill Lynch in the top layers of that institution, did you say to your fellow bankers then what you're saying now in books like Economics After the Crisis? Were you talking about...
No, I mean, the role I did in Merrill Lynch was focused on the mergers and acquisitions area.
Fair enough,
what's
but
corporate
generally
finance.
about the general point you make about the failures.
It's a very legitimate point. You know, I was involved in debates, and there were lots of things I got wrong. I certainly made intellectual mistakes. I did not, until the last 4 years, really go back to the basics of what do banks do? This amazing way that banks... It's sometimes described in the economics profession or in economics textbooks that banks take savings and work out where to put it. They don't. They simultaneously create new credit and new money. And that is a fundamental insight of what the banking system does, which largely got sort of ignored and forgotten by the economics profession in the years running up to the crisis.
Just on the specific issue of banks, they're so huge. They're so global, they're so powerful, and we talked about kind of the lobbying power. Are you someone who says it's time to break them up? It's time to break these big banks up? Because there's a debate here in the UK, in the United States, about what division there should be between the different parts of the banking sector. There's the retail banking sector, there's the high street bank, there's what's called the casino banking sector, the investment banking sector.
Well, as you know, in the UK, we have this plan to ring-fence them internally, and I think that will be a very useful step forward. It will give to the authorities, if banks get into trouble, much more degrees of freedom to say, well, let's keep the retail banking going and let the investment bank, if necessary, fail. So I'm a supporter of those proposals. I don't think there's any magic. I don't think there's any magic about small banks, though. Let's just remember the last big banking crisis of the early 1930s in the US was a banking crisis of lots and lots of small banks. Lots and lots of small banks can go, and in the UK we had problems with Northern Rock, with Bradford and Bingley. These were relatively small banks. So I don't think we should iconise small banks. I think the most fundamental things are much higher levels of capital, much higher levels of liquidity. To me, that's more important than the size of the banks themselves.
Jon Moulton, do you think we should break up the big banks?
Absolutely.
A ring fence won't do?
Ring fence is... It's an extraordinary process we're going through in the UK. It takes longer to actually ring-fence the banks than it took us to fight World War II. So there's not exactly a great rush about this process. It's not happening. It may very well not happen at all in any reasonable way. Would it protect? Yes, it would. At least the simple banks would be simple. They'd be manageable, which is something else we haven't talked about.
Costas, are banks too big to fail still?
Too big to fail is a subsidy to banks. People should realize it's a social subsidy to banks. Banks make the profits, they keep them in good times, and then the losses are basically passed on to society. But I think breaking up banks only goes that far. What we need to consider is actually the systemic failure of banks in terms of what they do in a capitalist economy. Banks are supposed not only to pass savings on, and I agree, they also create credit. Banks are also supposed to manage risk, to collect information, and to assess information. They are the nervous center of the capitalist economy. Now, that has manifestly failed. It's failed. And therefore, what I would say is we need to consider the failure of private banking, and we need to think seriously about public banking.
I don't think that just breaking them up is sufficient, and the reason for that is that banks not only create credit effectively out of thin air, they also price it, i.e. they determine the rate of interest. And it's the rate of interest that is rarely exploitative. If you're a subprimer and you borrow £300,000 to have a roof over your head, and they charge you 7, 8, 10, 15%, you're never going to be able to repay that except by extracting all of your wealth, really, from you. And we have lost, I mean, throughout history, throughout Christianity, throughout Islam, there have been strong prohibitions against usury and high rates of interest. We've forgotten that.
If you listen to our guests here, one of them is saying ring fence, break them up. One of them is talking about the ownership structure and the private ownership. One of them is talking about the capital controls and interest. I mean, you are much more radical than you were when you were a banker.
I know.
You don't seem to be radical enough.
Well, I mean, I think the bit where I've got much more radical, I think, is I have become convinced by the arguments that many have been put forward, which is slightly different in this category, that an ideal banking system would probably have leverage ratios of our banks of more like 5 to 1 than 50 to 1.
We're talking about banks as institutions. We're talking about the system. Costas has mentioned capitalism itself. If I bring the debate back to individuals, dare I, banks consist of bankers. Some of us are a little upset that 5 years after the crash, not a single leading banker on either side of the Atlantic has been put behind bars. Are you upset about that?
Well, you can only put them behind bars if they broke the rules that were in place then. And, you know, as the chair of the FSA, I was in charge of an enforcement organisation with lots of lawyers, and we looked carefully about whether there had been events which broke the existing rule book. And broadly speaking, we didn't find them.
What about the LIBOR rate reading scandal?
With LIBOR, we did bring fines against them. But to go back to the most fundamental thing, because this is really important. In many sectors of the economy, we accept that some firms will go bankrupt. Indeed, that is an essential part of the creative destruction process that leads innovation and growth forwards. The fundamental problem we have is that banking's different. When banks go bankrupt, they don't just... it isn't that enterprise fails, they can bring down the whole economy.
I'm asking a bigger question. Not just, are they too big to fail? Are they too big to jail?
That's why I think what we ought to be doing is not trying to jail them, but simply saying, when you become a director of a bank, your terms of employment, your terms of being a director, should force you to have a different trade-off between risk and return than is appropriate in another sector of the economy. I think we should say, if you're a director of a bank and it fails, then you will be automatically banned from being in the financial services again. I think we should say that bankers, including the non-executive directors, should put all of their fees into an escrow account and should lose that if it fails. But that's not criminal. That's not saying they're bad people. It's simply saying we want them to strike the balance between risk and return.
You don't think any bankers are bad people?
Very different.
You don't think any bankers are bad people, just to clarify?
Well, I'm sure some bankers are bad people, but most of them made trade-offs between risk and return which might have been perfectly legitimate if it had been in some other sectors of the economy, but were not right in the banking sector of the economy.
It's awful to watch. I mean, we have people in the replacement organisations for the FSA. We've got people there who are directors at senior levels in failed banks. We are still using the same people. We're using them in the Bank of England. We're using them in the regulators. We have had very little turnover, let alone putting them in jail. Okay, we haven't even changed them.
On that note, we haven't changed enough of the people. We've got bankers paying massive bonuses, which we haven't even got into. We've got a regulatory system, which we're still questioning. Banks too big to fail. What's going to stop another crash? Do you think we're going to get another crash in the next few years?
I don't think we're going to have another crash in the next few years, because we may come on to this later. I think we're in that period where our big problems now are getting the economy going.
You're not worried about another banking crash?
No, I'm very worried about it in 10 or 15 years, because I think as memories fade, as people believe that this time it's different, as people believe we're all cleverer than the previous generation and that there's some new, XYZ squared financial innovation that everybody believes has got rid of risks, we'll make the same mistakes again. I am concerned that we have not been radical enough in our reform.
Some would say that the financialised capitalism that you referred to, Costas and some of our guests referred to, is deeply unstable and deeply destabilising because of the massive and huge levels of inequality that it generates. Is that a fair criticism?
I'm not an egalitarian, I'm not a socialist, but I am worried about the sheer extent of the inequality that's now going. I think finance is part of that story. It's undoubtedly true, and there's been some very good academic research that shows that as the financial system has got bigger relative to the economy, it has played a major role in that expansion of inequality.
And did inequality play a role in the crash?
Well, I think inequality played a role in the crash in a way that I made a reference to earlier. I think in the US, you had an expansion of inequality, and you had a political culture in which you couldn't possibly say that the answer to that was to redistribute income to the losers, the bottom quarter of American society. But on the other hand, you needed a political response. And the political response was let them eat credit. It was the subprime boom.
Adair says he's not a socialist. Costas, I believe you are a socialist. Yes. Let me ask you this. Well, how complicated, Adair used the word it's complicated, how complicated do you think this massive explosion in income inequality, both nationally and globally, has been?
When you look at the income distribution, the top 1% in the United States and in this country has creamed off all the increase in productivity during the last 30 years. Now, how? Through finance. You see, finance has been a vital lever in this. People earn enormous incomes, wages, presumably, in the financial system. Wages? What wages? How can anybody earn wages of millions and millions of pounds a year? This is actually creaming off the surplus. Now, that can certainly be restrained. That can certainly be controlled.
How? How would you restrain it?
Impose controls on what bankers get paid for a start.
The government imposes control.
Of course. I mean, what is this notion of bonuses? People should get paid for doing a job.
Would you support or oppose a government which tried to tax bonuses as a way of dealing with them, a banker's bonus tax, which we had for a brief period in this country?
I think you can only do that as a temporary thing, because, as I say, you'll find also a thing like that, there are so many ways around it. And I think there is an illogic to ending up saying you're going to have a tax on bankers' bonuses, not other people's bonuses. You know, you should basically be aiming to make sure that your entire banking system is only doing things which are value-added rather than rent extraction.
Again, we're back at the complexity of regulation. I think it should be very straightforward. There will be no government guarantees, there will be no taxpayer-backed subsidies, there will be no bailouts unless bankers meet these conditions and terms.
We went through autumn 2008. I think we were right at that time to bail out the banks. Yes. I think if we had not bailed out the banks in autumn 2008,
the question is
we would now have 20% unemployment, not, you know,
agreed, but
9%.
The terms, as Anne puts it, what were the terms?
Well, I think we should ideally not have put money in. We should have nationalised them and wiped out the equity holders.
We've talked in this half, and we're bringing this half to a close, we've talked this half a lot about finance and the role played by finance in destabilising capitalism itself. Here's my question. Put the crash to one side and look at the bigger picture. How can anyone defend an economic model, a system, in which the richest 300 people control more wealth than 300 million or 3 billion people on this planet?
Well, I would defend liberal capitalism, the market economy, as, despite all of its faults, having done a better job than the alternatives, like...
The least worst system.
Like democracy, it is the least worst system. I think it's very important then to manage capitalism, to make sure that it doesn't go to excess. And I think we developed a belief before the crisis that we could go to the extreme of just believing that it was completely, you know, self-adjusting, that it would always produce perfect results. That's not true. We can have a better capitalism than we've got, but it requires self-confident states intervening and regulating in an appropriate fashion while also not getting in the way of the bits of the entrepreneurial process which are valuable. And I think we got it quite wrong, and I think the core of the way we got it wrong was in our wrong attitude to the financial system.
Well, OK, on that note, I'm going to bring part one to a close. In part two, we're going to be talking about the response to the crisis, the debate over austerity versus stimulus, the eurozone crisis, and we're going to be bringing in our audience. Join us after the break. You're watching Head to Head on Al Jazeera. We're talking about the financial crisis, the causes, the consequences. We're joined here in the Oxford Union by Lord Adair Turner, former head of Britain's financial regulator, the Financial Services Authority, author of the book Economics After the Crisis. Adair, we've been talking about the financial aspect, the banking part of it, and the crash. That was one of the big failures. You called it an intellectual, ideological failure in part one. But wasn't the other big failure, not the crash itself, but our response to the crash? We've seen governments really struggling to get to grips with how to respond to unemployment, the lack of growth, the debt crisis, haven't we?
We really didn't realise in spring 2009, as we got beyond the immediate stage of the crisis, we didn't realise how difficult it is to get economies going again when you first allowed debt in the private sector to get to too high a level. we all failed, the people in the official community failed back in 2009 to realise how difficult it then becomes to stimulate the economy. You cut the interest rate to zero, nothing much happens. You try what's called quantitative easing, which is the central bank buying the government debt to try and bring down long-term interest rates as well as short-term interest rates, but nothing much happens then either.
Has austerity failed?
I think we have been too certain that short-term austerity can produce a benefit. I think it's not true that short-term austerity produces a confidence effect. I think the difficulty is that when the debt levels, the public debt levels go up in the crisis, you feel, well, I've got to get that under control at some time. But I then think if you try to get it under control quickly by cutting your public expenditure or increasing taxes in the short term, you can enter a cycle where the very process of trying to get your debt levels down means you never get your debt levels down. Now, I've argued that in the face of that, we may need to consider some really radical policy options, such as what's called helicopter money, which is running increased public expenditure or tax cuts and paying for it, not with money that the government borrows, but with a central bank created money. So I think we need a very balanced approach which has a point of view of how we get public debt burdens under control over the medium term, but is more cautious about short-term cuts and fiscal austerity than most countries have been so far.
Jon Moulton, has austerity failed in the way that Adair Turner seems to say it does in the short term?
First of all, austerity has been incredibly mild. The previous government in the UK increased public expenditure by about 62% in real terms. We've taken about 3% out. So the austerity is very slight. It has occurred. I actually think it was probably inadequate because right the way across Europe, we'd got more and more public sector spending relative to the size of the economy.
That's absolute nonsense.
No, shut up.
That is absolute.
OK, well, Anne wants to go. Anne says absolute nonsense. Why is it absolute nonsense?
Absolute
I'll come back to you,
nonsense. The real crisis, as Lord Turner has spelled out very carefully, was a private financial debt crisis. That the private finance sector dumped huge amounts of debt. Britain is one of the most indebted nations in the world, and it's private debt, it's not public debt. And there is an ideological refusal to address the private financial crisis. Instead, there's an opportunity taken, and really viciously, opportunity taken to attack the public sector, and that is what's happening
Jon,
now.
I will come back to you one moment. Costas, Jon Moulton says austerity here in the UK has been mild. You're a Greek economist. We all know about austerity in Greece. What has happened in Greece as a result of austerity economics?
Austerity in Greece has been phenomenal, and it's basically what happened in the UK times hundreds, because austerity is a bad idea generally when the problem is debt. And the problem is private debt, because austerity basically doesn't achieve what it sets out to achieve. It's a fallacy, it's a logical fallacy and a policy fallacy. To deal with debt, you need growth, or you need to write it off. Austerity doesn't cure debt. And what it creates is unemployment and more problems.
There's two things about austerity. One is absolutely austerity hurts an economy and causes the pain that you're talking about in Greece. No argument. Greece should have defaulted, absolutely. Would have been much less painful, or been able to inflate its currency, which it couldn't. What you do need to do, which is not quite the same austerity, is cutting the size of the public sector to enable a larger private sector to... You just don't even look at the bloody data.
I am looking at the data.
The data shows that large public sectors lead to low growth.
The data shows that private investment has collapsed under the burden of debt, dumped on it by banking system.
Okay.
In that case, we need public investment, and that's precisely why the economy cannot recover, because we've cut public investment as well as private investment.
I think the answer is that you can have a different balance of problems in different economies. If you look around the eurozone economies, I think it is a reasonable case that in the case of Greece, part of the problems were created by public debt. And what happened in Ireland and Spain was absolutely clearly an explosion of private credit, particularly in the housing and commercial real estate sectors, which then blew up and then tipped the economy into recession, and then the public debt started going up. But the basic cause was the private sector in Ireland and Spain.
Costas and Jon have both mentioned Greece and whether Greece should have defaulted. Costas is a supporter of Greece exiting the euro. Do you think it's time for an orderly dismemberment of the eurozone?
Greece will not pay back the full amount of this public debt. I mean, this is just a fantasy that we're all pretending. You can either default and stay in the eurozone or default and leave the eurozone. My belief now is that for the eurozone to survive, it will have to go really quite a long way down a route of federalisation, of centralisation. And I think you've got to have Eurobonds, a category of Eurobonds, and I think in particular the most crucial thing, we've got to break this terrible link we have at the moment between bank solvency and state solvency. And what that means is, when a bank gets into trouble in Spain, if you think you've got to rescue it in order not to have a worse knock-on effect to the economy, you've got to do that with central Eurozone resources. Because if you try and do it with Spanish state resources, you'll simply make the Spanish state in a worse solvent position. This is what's called the banking union. There is a commitment to have it, but I think they are going to have to go a long way down that line to make this workable.
And in the late 1990s, you were one of the big supporters of the Euro project, of British membership of the Euro.
I was wrong, and I tell you what has made me really think about this. I failed to see that the big problem would be the way that a single currency area... People said, well, we'll have a single currency area, and the great thing is you'll get capital flows across this single currency area. Capital will flow to the low productivity areas, and they'll build up businesses in Spain, etc. Well, we got huge capital flows, but unfortunately they didn't turn into, increases in productivity in low productivity areas. They went into commercial real estate and housing.
Okay. Very briefly, let me ask each of our panellists here, do you think the euro will survive? Should it survive? John?
Euro will survive. I suspect parts of it will not survive. That'll be the best answer for some of the countries. It's the United States of Europe or no euro.
No, I don't think it can survive because it's a deeply flawed and very undemocratic currency. It is one on which states have lost the power to manage their finances, and they have had to transfer that power to something called the Troika, none of whom are elected and who are dictating policy.
OK, Costas?
I think the euro in its current form is unsustainable. And I think the idea of a federal state or Eurobonds or a banking union basically is pie in the sky. I don't think it's going to happen because this is a collection of states, national states. I think the main problem of the euro is actually Germany. It's not none of these other issues. The problem is Germany, which has been keeping wages low and creating a competitive advantage for itself. And this is actually appearing more and more relative to France now and relative to Italy. It has crashed the periphery, and it's now crashing France and Italy. And that is when the problems are going to emerge in full earnest.
Well, we've talked about banking, the crash, finance, regulation, inequality, tax rates, austerity, stimulus, the eurozone. Time for you to come in with your views on any of those subjects. Raise your hands, make your points. Please keep them as brief as possible. Let's go to the lady here in the front row.
Good evening. I'm one of those terrible academic economists that caused all the trouble in the first place. One of the things that students want to hear in the first year when one teaches economics is why on earth in a crisis we are not doing the policies that the textbooks suggest we should be doing. There needs to be only public spending helps when we're in a recession, and there are issues about how that public spending is generated, of course, and about the terms on which new debt is contracted and all the rest of it. However, that's what they expect.
Why didn't we do the classic things? Well, in a sense, we did. Back at the London conference, G20 conference in April 2009, there was a commitment to a coordinated response, which at the time did involve a fiscal stimulus. And frankly, that was a success.
Gentleman here in the second row behind you.
Yes, hi. Many of you might know me as the H-Boss whistleblower. I've been there and I've done it, and I've got the T-shirt, and I want to say a couple of things. About the past, it wasn't that there was just something rotten in the state of Denmark. Everything, from the politicians, the regulatory system, the accountants, the non-executive directors, the whole system. We can't talk about that for a long time. Let's talk about the future. We need to find, as you said, Adair, a new monetary system, a new way of finding our way between austerity and growth. Don't you think that a system in which about 25 executive directors of the big four banks are in control of the creation and the direction of 80 to 85% of our money supply through the issuance of debt, is a bad way to run an economy and a banking system. Don't you think full reserve banking is a much, much better way to go?
Do you want to respond to that?
This is an incredibly interesting debate. I just want to make sure everybody understands what full reserve banking is. It's an environment where for every deposit that you make as a member of the public at a bank, there is a matching, either note or coin in the vault or a reserve at the central bank. It's full reserve banking. I'm not quite in that camp. And what's very interesting about the debates on full reserve banking is that it was supported by some people, some mid-20th century economists, who in every other sector of the economy were the most extreme free market people of all. So I'm in a slightly intermediate position, which is not 100% reserve banks, but I certainly believe in much more liquid banks and much more heavily capitalised banks. But you are in the very radical camp there.
We've had a fair few pot shots taken at the banks tonight. Is there anyone here in the audience who wants to come in and say, actually, they're not all bad? Do we have any supporters here who think banks are getting a bad rap who want to come in and... No? Nobody? Oh, gentleman here. Brave gentleman here in the second row.
Isn't there a danger that if we go too far in criticising financial services, that actually we do down a sector in which the UK is, in fact, very strong?
I think the difficulty the UK economy has is that because before the crisis, the scale of finance, in addition to those useful value-add activities, was also doing a whole load of unnecessary activities, the UK economy had in part ended up earning its way in the world by selling some services that the rest of the world didn't need, which weren't good for them, and they rumbled us after 2008, which is one of the reasons why the worst thing that's happened on the UK current account situation over the last 4 years is the fall in our financial services exports.
Country by country, do you think governments and societies should be looking again, say across the West for a start, at the size of the financial sector?
I think we ought to look at the size of the financial sector. I don't think you can have a point of view, it has to be size X, not size Y. But I do think there was a dangerous belief before the crisis where people looked at the rise in size of, the increasing size of the financial sector as a percent of national income, and they actually asserted that that was definitionally good. And that was an intellectual mistake.
OK, gentleman there on the second row in the glasses.
Yes, my name is Eric Guichard. I'm CEO of a company called Home Strings, which facilitates the transfer of remittances from the West to the emerging markets. One of the concerns that I have with respect to regulatory reform, is the fact that much of those discussions are inward-looking and not looking at what the ripple effect or the unintended consequences are of those nationally focused reforms, specifically on the emerging markets. The question here is, if you focus on stringent regulation, aren't you affecting the impact that these transfers are having on the emerging markets, which in some cases account for 20% of their GDP?
Well, I think what you've illustrated is this incredibly important thing about financial deepening, providing new financial services. Some financial deepening is good, and some is completely unnecessary. And your business of remittances, which is often very important when you have émigré communities sending back money, doing that in an efficient fashion and a cost-efficient fashion is important. The difficulty is it often gets hijacked by the people who want to turn up in an emerging market and say, well, what you want immediately is a corporate bond market and a derivatives market and a futures market, where actually what they want is step one, which is a good basic banking industry serving, small businesses.
I see the gentleman here at the front.
My question is, much focus seems to be on structural change, which then shapes the behavior of actors, rather than going directly at the heart of it. Why don't we try to shape the actors themselves, the bankers, regulators, like the people in the sector?
How do we do that? How do we change there?
I think human beings are human beings. They're a mixture of good and bad and selfish and altruistic. And
people say bankers are particularly greedy. Do you share that view?
No, I don't. I think there's something about sitting in front of a screen all day rather than being involved in some economic process that involves you seeing your customer face to face or dealing with some physical product, which, unless you're very careful, can produce a sort of moral distance from the consequences of your actions. Your actions just become an extension of computer games by other means. And I think that is a sort of ethical danger in banking, which is very important that the management of banks, guard against. And I think that was illustrated in the LIBOR case. If you just end up sitting in a dealing room thinking all that matters is that I make money at the end of the day, well, why shouldn't I cheat a bit? Because the real customers, the real end product is so distant that you've lost sight of it.
Gentleman there, second in with the beard.
I teach development and environmental economics. I think in the context of the financial crisis discussion, something very big and very vital is being missed. At this moment, the biggest crisis humanity is facing is the ecological crisis. Climate change and global warming. It's of a hugely important dimension than the financial crisis. And if we keep that in mind, then we need to relook at the way you are talking about the benefits of capitalism. Capitalism is inherently unstable on economic system. And even those who want to reform it by saying stimulus, that will actually damage the environment. So we'll actually move out of the economic crisis, we'll land into what deeper ecological crisis?
I have been, for the last 4 years, both chairman of the UK's Climate Change Committee and of the FSA. And I see this as, two different tasks. One is stability of a system. Let's not have self-inflicted wounds of unemployment. But you're quite right. The bigger challenge long-term is, I think, climate change. And we will not solve that with an entirely free financial system. You need a vision of the state as to what we're going to do, but then you have to use the financial system as well. And, capitalism is a very powerful mechanism at the detailed level for driving efficiency, driving productivity, but it needs to do it within an overall framework of policy which is clearly set by the government.
Do you think capitalism, yes or no, shorten it, is environmentally destructive, as the questioner is asking? You chair the Climate Change Committee?
Not inherently, no. It can be managed to be less environmentally destructive. And again, I make the point I make earlier. You want environmental destruction, go to what Soviet Union did. They managed to overdo us.
Eco-socialism, not socialism.
Yep. Let's go to running out of time. The gentleman to your right.
I think if anybody wants to know what went wrong in banking, they ought to read the Saltz Review of Barclays, which was issued recently. It actually states that the 60 best paid employees, the bonus pool for them exceeded the amount of money paid to dividend to shareholders. My question is, where were the shareholders? How do they allow this? Are these people fit to own banks? And if not, should the state take them over?
Well, it's a very good question. The answer is, I don't think this problem is tractable. I mean, this issue of are shareholders really active enough in enforcing their ownership of large public companies? No, they're not. Too many operate simply on the basis of, if I'm unhappy, I'll sell the shares and move elsewhere. Okay. They're very wary of really enforcing their point of view, but I'm not sure that's a tractable problem.
I wanted to ask, we're looking at a financial system these days which has become so internationalized and it's so extraordinarily large and complex that we can't even model it. Most of the time we don't even know what it's doing. To what extent would you say that we now have an ungovernable financial system?
Well, one of my answers to that is that we should not oppose the idea that when we do have large global banks, we should insist that in each of their major countries of operation, they have subsidiaries which are separately capitalized, separately liquid, and separately regulated, so that although they are sharing skills and approaches and brand, and there may be some value in that, if they get into trouble, you can say the fact that one of them's in trouble at a global level, the Mexicans can say, we've got a bank which we can make sure is okay. So, and this is a very important point because you get an ideological opposition to what's called fragmentation of the global financial system. I think that's scare tactics. We shouldn't be worried about strong national subsidiaries.
My name's Chris Fursden Davis, occupy London Stock Exchange and London Economics Working Group. I know nothing about economics. I'm a doctor. I'm glad you haven't totally caught the disease of neoliberalism, but clearly you're still touched by it, but I hope you're coming out of it, and you may have some hope of things being better. My point is about practical answers. I put in, with my colleagues, a petition to Number 10 Downing Street to build public sector housing for rent only. And my point really is, why can we not invest in that way from public sector spending, which in the long term will be a wonderful asset?
Why can't we invest in the public sector in the way that we've, say, propped up the banks with public money?
Well, I think the UK has a shortage of supply which has been absolutely not solved by the easy supply of credit. I mean, broadly speaking, the supply of credit into the UK housing system simply drove up the price of the housing stock that had existed. Unlike in Ireland and Spain, it didn't produce a housing boom. The answer is I don't know enough about that specific issue, but I'm certainly not against it in any ideological sense.
Let me ask very quickly, since he mentioned he was from Occupy, the Occupy movement we saw across the globe. As someone who's involved in finance, a financial regulator, when you were watching all that unfold, were you quietly quite admiring of what they were doing? Your book
I thought it was an absolutely legitimate expression of anger and
positive,
concern.
Not legitimate.
Yes, I think it was, on the whole, positive. I think when people, do things which are of that form, but in a non-violent form, we should pay attention to them.
Final question from the audience here, from this lady here.
I'm Lynn Bivings from Oxford Brookes University, and Lord Turner describes a model of capitalism that he would like to see, but one that actually seems to rely on people actually behaving ethically, people having a moral imperative, people not being greedy. Can we be confident that actually there are people in place, in power, who are going to behave in that way?
Well, you see, I responded... I don't think you're going to change human nature, right? So human nature has a certain balance of selfishness and altruism, which is sort of, it's a given. But I think we can do better at structuring the rules of the game, right? So that it makes it more likely that their altruistic elements come to the fore, not their selfish. But I'm wary of anything that imagines that we're going to make the world better people. One has to design social systems that work well with people with all the mix of, nice and nasty that they are.
I think that's a perfect note on which to end the programme. We've run out of time there. Lord Adair Turner, thank you very much for sparing time to come here and talk to us all and give us some insights. We've got a real problem in the world today, and I think we've debated some of them tonight. Thank you all for coming and contributing here in the Oxford Union. And thank you all for watching at home. Head to Head will be back here in the Oxford Union on Al Jazeera next week. Good night.